And now part 2 of the history of Moby Grape. I last left you at the apparent success of Wow, the second Moby Grape album, which hit number 20 on the Billboard chart in spite of not having a hit single to support it. Now, reviews were generally positive for this album, and the risks that producer David Rubinson took seemed to be the right ones in the Sgt. Pepper world that the music business lived in. With the second album in the can, recordings continued for what would be the third album, and one of the songs they worked on first was Skip Spence's Seeing, which was an excellent song, and Bob Mosley's It's a Beautiful Day Today. Peter Lewis began working on If You Can't Learn From My Mistakes, and other songs included Soul Stew and Cockatoo Blues. So like the Wow album, many of these newer tracks were done in a piecemeal fashion without the whole band being present. By mid-1968, Matthew Cates re-entered the picture in dubious fashion by putting a bogus Moby Grape band out on the road. And this provided confusion for many promoters who wanted to hire the real band. And the real band had to resort to being billed as the authentic Moby Grape for a time period. After being fired by the band, Cates busied himself by creating his own label called the San Francisco Sound. He also opened a new club with that same name, but in Seattle, and he increased his stable of psychedelic bands to include It's a Beautiful Day, Black Swan, Melvin Q. Watch Pocket, Tripsichord Music Box, and West Coast Natural Gas, which he renamed Indian Puddin' and Pipe. So we see Cates really having jumped on the psychedelic bandwagon here and exploiting the name San Francisco in every one of his ventures. Now, promoters were on their guard, and even though the real Moby Grape was getting the main bookings, it still created confusion for the band and some unrest. Some of that instability included Peter Lewis moving back to Los Angeles temporarily and taking a break from the band. He didn't like being away from his family and didn't like the fact that they shifted their operations to New York. So the band continued as a four-piece without him and played several shows at the Fillmore East in June of 1968 without him. Buffalo Springfield and Moby Grape were pretty close to one another, and at one point there was even discussion of a trade, Neil Young for Peter Lewis. And although that was probably just talk and never happened. So around this time, Skip Spence also started to decline. His drug use had increased, his LSD use increased, and he was starting to dabble in heroin, as is reported by some band members, and his moods could swing from good to bad. And he used to be just a real bubbly, upbeat guy, and his behavior started to change, and he kind of lost his mojo as the rest of the band started to disintegrate. By this time, they had moved into the Albert Hotel in New York, and this was a place a lot of musicians stayed and artists, and there was some rehearsal space. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was an artist place. And at one point, road manager Tim DeLara received a note from apparently a groupie. Her name was Joanna Wells. And up to this point, Skip Spence had this magnetic personality and really drew people to him. He always kind of had a following, and that was just his personality. But this time, Skip was drawn to this woman. Now, once he met her, he didn't come back for a few nights and missed some rehearsals and maybe even a gig, and he had moved in with her. So this is the point where Skip Spence completely changed. And mind you, he was married with three children at this point, so he was really straying rather far here, moving with this woman who was a self-proclaimed witch. Now, Don Stevenson and Jerry Miller went to visit them at the apartment he was now living. They arrived and Skip was there with Joanna and an old man on the couch who looked like a street person, and they referred to him as Father. But one thing that they noticed was this Joanna had complete control over Skip. At this visit, Skip told Don and Jerry that the father told him that he couldn't play in the band anymore. And after this point, there was two main incidents that happened. In the first incident, Skip and Joanna showed up at the studio, and according to Bob Mosley, he was loaded to the gills. And Skip asked Mosley to be in a band with him. And Mosley kind of said, well, okay, I will, but not if you're going to bring this girl around. Don't want any part of it. And after that point, Joanna started hitting Bob Mosley in the face. And then she went after art director Bob Cato with his scissors. So this incident ended very badly. And after that, Skip Spence went to the Albert Hotel and picked up his remaining belongings in the room that he shared with Bob Mosley. Now, Bob Mosley was quoted as saying that when Spence met this Joanna, he changed overnight. So the second incident was even worse. This was an altercation that happened when Skip returned to the Albert Hotel in search of Don Stevenson. He was really high and took a fire hatchet from the hotel and began chopping at their door. Finding them not there, he headed for the studio, but by that time, Stevenson and Miller were on their way back home to the Albert Hotel. They found the door chopped up, and they immediately called producer David Rubinson, telling him that Skip was coming to kill him. Skip arrived with the axe by taxi and was wearing only his pajamas. Security was waiting for him, and Rubinson talked him into dropping the axe, and the police were called. So there was a formal complaint made by Stevenson and Miller to the police, and then I guess he was taken to Bellevue. And they did that because they didn't want him to, hurt anybody or hurt himself. So they had him, essentially had him committed. So with all this going on, with the band falling apart, the Wow album is peaking on the charts. So they've got a fairly big hit on their hand, and the band is completely disintegrating here. So the band picked up, moved back to California, and regrouped with Peter Lewis to assess the situation. And together they agreed to press on. They had a fairly big show coming up, the Schaefer Music Festival. And they agreed to take a little break outside of that show so that they can just kind of get their marbles together. But they did press on. Now, they didn't think at this point that Skip wouldn't return to them. They just figured this was just something that went horribly wrong with drugs and that he probably would return to them at some point. The way people look at this in hindsight, Skip's rapid decline, they blame LSD, or a drug psychosis is what they call it. Here are some quotes from the band members. So Jerry Miller said, "We should have never been at the Albert Hotel. That's where Skippy met those people who led him astray. He just kept rolling downhill with the loonies and Nazis and sewer rats." Bob Mosley said, "I could see it coming. I saw Skippy going off the deep end with drugs. Skip became very impressionable and got this messianic complex where he believed he was an antichrist figure." Peter Lewis said, "Skip got into serious trouble, taking up with a witch called Joanna. She definitely had power over Skip. In the 60s, there were these chicks who were like sex witches. They used their crank as a whip. He turned from Mr. Love to Mr. Hate in a weekend. He thought he was the Antichrist." And then Don Stevenson said, "He saw things that were so real to him. It was like he went into another dimension. I look at it as if he was following a path he thought was right, and I was protected by whatever, by angels." Don Stevenson believes that his trip to visit Skip at that apartment was what triggered this whole incident, because Skip came after Don with the axe. And the only thing I can figure is this combination of LSD and the occult here triggered something with those people. And Don Stevenson was he had on him what sounds like a rosary. Maybe it was a blessed rosary or something, but there's something about his presence there that one time going there, after that is when Skip came after him with an axe. Don has talked a little bit about that, speculation. I'm speculating a bit. We don't really know, but that seems to have some bearing on this whole event. And you see this cult-like behavior, mixing drugs. You see this in the Manson thing. And there was a Peter Green incident with Fleetwood Mac was very similar. So this was not uncommon, or it's been recorded, let's put it that way. So with Spence out indefinitely, the band had to kind of reinvent themselves and relearn how to play live and just kind of get it together. Now, maybe Skip Spence should have taken the axe and gone after Matthew Cates, because at this point, Cates slapped a $1 million lawsuit on the band for using the name Moby Grape. So, as you see, Cates just won't go away. The band is continuing to tour using their name, so they're basically ignoring this. But they do have to deal with the legalities of this accusation. So the foursome regrouped in Santa Cruz to start working on their third album, Moby Grape 69. So the foursome is working together, Rubinson is back in tow, and he's producing. And overall, despite what's going on around them, this album is quite positive. And I think it was somewhat of a reaction to the production style of Wow. So it's a little more scaled back, and it sounds a little bit more like the production of the first album.
Yeah.
songs are rootsy and introspective, and they have a good energy to them. And they also have some good energy in their ballads as well.
She said she loves me, and I could always come to her. Beginning a brand new day, I love her hearing people say it's a beautiful day today. What to choose if you need of me, and no, I can't refuse.
Perhaps the best song on this album is the Skip Spence song, Seeing. And this is a song that basically foretells his demise. Skip was on that last track, and it was recorded before his breakdown. And I think the band was hoping he might get back in time to finish the album, but the album was wrapped up by late November of 1968, which is when Skip got out of Bellevue. Moby Grape 69 came out in January of 69. Very good album. This is not a masterpiece. It's not a great album, but it's very solid. Everybody's in good voice. The production is good. Everything is good. One of the things that's a little bit odd are the liner notes. So David Rubinson, the producer, wrote the liner notes, and it's basically a big apology for all the hype that they did 2 years before. So for whatever reason, I don't know what possessed them to think that an apology was necessary after all this time. I would have thought most people would have forgotten about it. Probably some didn't even know about it, but it made no sense to bring that up on this album. Here's some of what he said. Few recording acts get the initial build-up which the Grape got when they started. They themselves demanded the enormous hype, but they didn't know what they had started, nor did I, and logically, they couldn't ever live up to their notices. You know, this is a bonehead move, and again, Columbia just trips over themselves time and time again. And this album actually got to number 113, so that may seem like a low chart, but it's kind of in the middle of the album chart. While this album was being readied for release, Skip Spence got out of the hospital, and as the myth goes, he hopped right on his motorcycle and went to Nashville and recorded an album. Well, that's a myth. That's not true. Once he got out, David Rubinson, who was still in New York, took care of him and got him set up a little bit with some clothing and some money. And Skip Spence rode the motorcycle back home to California. Meanwhile, Rubinson arranged for an album to be done in Nashville. So what Skip Spence did, he went home to his wife and kids, and together they gathered up many of their things. They drove a U-Haul out to Nashville. Now, staying at a Nashville hotel very close to the studio, Skip spent a couple weeks down there recording, and then after the recording was done, they went to New York to mix it. Or was released in May of 1969, and it was billed as by Alexander Spence, so he was foregoing his nickname. And it's considered by some to be the ramblings of a clinically paranoid schizophrenic, or by others as the work of a genius. I tend to think it's somewhere in the middle, but I will say that for somebody who just got out of Bellevue, a month or so before, it's rather a focused album. And many people they look at this album as if every song is some introspective look as to how he broke down and went mad. I don't really see it that way at all. I would describe this album as one of the original singer-songwriter albums, which really describes some of the fallout of some of the hippie ideals that have been romanticized over the decades.
It sent his memories in its body and its blood. Wet in the water, weeping on the sun.
Books of Moses gives Stephen Stills a little run for his money, and I think the overall guitar work on this album is really good. I mean, at times it's somewhat rudimentary, but he gets so much sound out of using so few notes. War and Peace was always my favorite track on the album, and sonically, this album was probably somewhat groundbreaking to the few people that actually heard it then. And I can't help but thinking when I hear some of these songs what they would have been like if they were done by the full band Moby Grape. Now, supposedly this album was, at the time, the lowest selling album in the history of the company, which adds to the lore of the album, but I've never seen any numbers to back that up or any comparable numbers with other low-selling albums, so that might be just part of the Skip Spence myth. By late summer of 1969, Skip Spence and his wife Pat had their fourth child, so that kept them busy for a little while. Meanwhile, Moby Grape finally got it together and filed an action with the Labor Commissioner requesting to set aside their contract with the Cates due to fraud, breach of contract, and labor code violations. So not long after that, they decided to tour Europe. They were in Amsterdam, Edinburgh, and it was some of the shows were very good, some were a little bit spotty, but the main thing is when they returned, Bob Mosley left the band. And he was broke, and he had wanted to go back to school, and he got drafted by the Army, so he decided to join the Marines. Now that the band was down to a threesome, they pondered their options, but they didn't ponder very long because they only had one option, which was to record a fourth album, which they owed to Columbia. So it's too bad they couldn't force Matthew Cates to do the album since he wants to take everything else. So they hired Bob Moore as the bassist to replace Bob Mosley. Now Moore had played with people like Elvis, Roy Orbison, Flatt and Scruggs, and Dylan. He was a Nashville veteran, and Columbia paired them with producer Bob Johnston, who had recorded The Byrds, Johnny Cash, Simon & Garfunkel, and Bob Dylan. This is the fourth album, Truly Fine Citizen, July 1969. The security guard on the cover was a guy they befriended at the studio. So we got the three guys, and I guess this is Bob Moore with his back to the camera. And this album is actually rather mellow.
I wonder, did the truth just pass me by? Or did I just not see what was right before my eyes?
Ooh, sweet on you. Two flaming souls, the truth they're gonna be down.
Blue girl, believe everything that they say.
And one of the things we can always count on Moby Grape are fine harmonies, and the instrumentation is very good, production is solid, so overall it's just a very tight album, and some of it's got some country angle to it and a little bit of jazz thrown in as well.
Spinning, can't tell the finish from the beginning. Crying as our laughter split the air, and I was one inside with you.
Now, song for song, I wouldn't say it's quite as strong as Moby Grape 69, but for those of you who like this band, I would say this is an album to certainly try out.
Come on, baby, and make me feel right. Come on, baby, and love me tonight. Come on now, don't you be...
Now, by 1969, a lot of the 60s psychedelic bands that had food in their names, like Moby Grape or Peanut Butter Conspiracy, Strawberry Alarm Clock, Ultimate Spinach, the Electric Prunes. They were all struggling with their third or fourth album by this time, and they were in the same position Moby Grape is. They were actually in worse position because Moby Grape still had all of its original had three of its original members, so it always maintained a certain sound that never left them. But the psychedelic period was done by this point, and a name like Moby Grape probably didn't help them. And since they weren't able to really recapture any commercial success, they packed it in after this album. By some strange miracle, the 5 members of this group reconvened a year later in 1971. And Bob Mosley at this point had been discharged from the Marines. Skip Spence had been out of the hospital and he was, doing okay. And the rest of the band was looking for another project, I guess. And David Rubinson came back as the producer, and they got a new label with Warner Brothers, and they did this album called 20 Granite Creek. Now, this was a second chance for the band, and I think an opportunity for them to finish, do some unfinished business. And although the band played on the entire album, just like the first album, there was still some personality conflicts within the band. One of the things I appreciated about this album is the return of the crosstalk guitars.
Going on down to Texas. I stood upon the meadow in a summer winter day, watching.
That last Peter Lewis song was rather jangly, but his Horse Out in the Rain was a heavy piece of late 1960s psych.
There's a horse out in the rain.
Now, Chinese Song was Skip's contribution to this album, and the koto is the lead instrument in this instrumental. And though it really cuts to the core of the band in a subtle way, and it's too bad that Skip didn't bring any of the leftover tracks from the Orr sessions to the group, because those might have made some very good inclusions here. But unfortunately, Skip started medicating with heroin and other drugs, alcohol. The meds that he had been on, I don't know if he was staying on his meds, but he was self-medicating, and he wasn't able to contribute a lot as much as the other members on this album, unfortunately. But there was still a great deal of camaraderie. This album is looked at as an album of redemption, and several Pyrrhic victories along within this album for the band, if not for the fans. So I don't know how fans really feel about this album. I like it. If you were a completist, I would definitely get it. It has some wonderful stuff on it, but some stuff that maybe isn't fully realized of a band that just is tired and whose time has passed. They did a short tour to support this album, and they were the third last act to play the Fillmore East before it closed. Now, reviews at the time of this album were mixed. Here's the back. And I think people were hoping, I don't think people had high expectations. The critics, that is. I think the fans always have high expectations, but those that were left, I don't know. I think they may have been a little bit disappointed, but retrospectively, everybody loves this album. It did chart. Not very high, very low, but I'm surprised it charted at all. So one thing I can say about the last two albums, Granite Creek and Truly Fine Citizen, is that it did kind of set a template of sorts for the country rock that we heard that became the West Coast California sound in the early 70s that was adopted by the likes of the Doobie Brothers and the Eagles. So that's something to be proud of. Now, perhaps to capitalize on the release of 20 Granite Creek, they were touring, of course, and this album charted. Columbia released a, what you would call, I guess, greatest hits. This is a retrospective best of. Not a bad compilation. It came out in 1971. And although they didn't really have hits, they couldn't call it greatest hits, so they called it Great Grape. Now, in 1973, they released Fine Wine. That was just Miller and Mosley on that album with former Lovecraft member Michael Bean. And that was a German-only release, but I understand that's a pretty good album. And then this was released on a budget label of Columbia's called Omaha, which is basically Moby Grape 69 minus 2 tracks plus the song Omaha. So it's like, why bother? But this was a Canadian release. They had several reunions on and off through the years, varying success. Skip Spence started working a little bit with the guys who became the Doobie Brothers in the early 70s. But unfortunately, heroin, cocaine, alcoholism got the better of him, and it resulted in further involuntary committal. He died of lung cancer in 1999. Bob Mosley released an album in 1972, and the following year he formed the Darrow Mosley Band with Chris Darrow, formerly of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band and of the Kaleidoscope, and issued one album, Desert Rain. In 1977, Mosley played with Neil Young in a band called the Ducks. Now, Jerry Miller continued to play and recorded a number of solo albums, while Don Stevenson maintained a steady career in music, but also had some success in real estate. Now, Peter Lewis has been instrumental in helping both Skip Spence and Bob Mosley get back on their feet at certain times in their lives, and he played in a version of the Electric Prunes in the early 2000s, and has recently released another solo album called Imagination. So with all the litigation over the years, the band had to go by several different names, including Mabby Grape, the Melvilles, Mosley Grape, Grape Escape, Fine Wine, The Grape, the Hermans, and the Legendary Grape. So the fight for the rights of their songs and use the name only took 4 decades to sort out, and the 4 survivors in the estate of Skip Spence filed a suit against Cates to finally resolve the litigation in 2005. And the Superior Court of California decreed that all ownership rights relating to the recordings and songs prior to 1973 are the sole property of Moby Grape. It also stipulated that Cates was to pay back royalties and that the band members now own the Moby Grape name. Now, Cates appealed, but the Court of Appeal upheld the original verdict in 2006. So good news, right? Well, the very wonderful record company called Sundazed was poised to re-release all their stuff on LP and CD. And this, I believe, is in 2007. And when I think everything was pressed, and they just went to market with them when Cates threatened them with a litigation over the ownership of the artwork of all the albums. So they had to recall everything. So any of that stuff that did leak out is worth a lot of money. And their work remained out of print because of Cates' efforts to thwart that artwork. To put this into some perspective, the Jefferson Airplane was in litigation with Cates over the rights and publishing of their music for 21 years. And It's a Beautiful Day, that was over 21 years. It took them to get their stuff back. And for Moby Grape, it took about 4 decades. So yeah, Cates, he died recently. And, it's really a shame that he didn't have a fair bone in his body. All right, so one thing you can get, here's the Ore album. I've got that on CD. There are bonus tracks on here as well. This is a Sunday's release. We've got Vintage. This is a 2-disc compilation. This came out in 1993, so I was thrilled to get this. And this has some unreleased stuff. Some of the tracks that I played, the alternate versions, are on this. It's got, I believe, the whole first album, but there are 48 songs on this compilation. One of the other albums I would turn your attention to is called The Place and the Time. It's another Sunday's compilation. They billed it as the Great Lost Moby Grape album. So it consists of demos, outtakes, alternate versions, and live versions. That's available on CD and vinyl. Now, The Place and the Time also has some of those alternate cuts that I played earlier, so those are both on. Some of those are on this compilation.
Love and understanding people to appear.
And last but not least, there are a couple books you can find on the band. What is Big in Purple and Lives in the Ocean? The Moby Grape Story. This is by Cam Cobb. This is a very comprehensive story from their early days through the rest of their career. And Cobb also wrote Weighted Down, The Complicated Life of Skip Spence. So those of you Skip Spence fans will want to check this out as well. So Cobb is a Moby Grape fan, but I feel that he tells the story very even-handedly. You know, when I think about this band, I just don't see them as the big tragedy that a lot of other people see them as. And like most bands, Moby Grape did not have financial success, which is very common for bands. And money and chart success isn't always the way to measure success. And the fact that the West Coast sound of the 70s was built on a foundation of Moby Grape music, that's something very few bands can claim. And the fact that we're talking about the band after all these years is a testament to their music and not the myths. Well, thank you so much for watching. That is a good band to get off my very tall pile of bands to do. As always, I've got merchandise. So check out popgoesthe60s.com for the latest in Pop Goes the 60s wear. And for those of you who want to support this channel in a bigger way, please check out my Patreon subscription. And if you don't want to do that, you can just subscribe. That works too. Thanks for watching Pop Goes the 60s.